magazine. That's the armory. Male slave dungeon. So this is where they process the slaves. They were getting ready to ship to other parts of the world. Portuguese church. 1636.
Hello.
Hello.
So Aquaba.
Aquaba.
Medasi. So my name is
Medasi.
Kojo. On Monday, going to be your guide for this historical experience. And our tour is going to be a walking tour. But before we start the experience, we need an introduction about the slave dungeon. The Mandan people refer to this structure as a castle. But personally, it is very insulting. It's very unfortunate because we cannot refer to this structure as a castle, knowing the atrocities that our ancestors went through. Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without the knowledge of their own past history, origin, or culture is like a tree without roots." And Malcolm X also said, "History is people's memory, and without it, a man is demoted to a lowest animal." Why this good from these personalities? It is because of the experience that we are going to have today. As we connect with this slave dungeon, we are going to see how the journey of our ancestors began from this. Why this dungeon? This was the first slave dungeon, built by the Portuguese in the year 1482. As you speak, this dungeon is 543 years old. The oldest, the biggest, the largest, and the first to come into contact with the slave trade. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in the year 1471 to trade and to spread Christianity as they claimed to do. And the key word over here is the word claimed. How could one be say, "I am worshiping God"? And under their watch are people suffering. So what type of God were they worshiping? Only they could tell us. But the system of trade was barter, that is exchange of goods for goods. So when they were coming from Portugal, they came along with European goods. Some included guns, gunpowder, used clothes, rum, mirrors, liquors, and among others, in exchange for the gold, ivory, and later spices. Due to the abundance of gold in this area and the rate at which the barter was going on, the Portuguese named this town Elmina, which simply means the mine, which later was corrupted into present-day Elmina. But one may ask, what was the original name before the Portuguese arrived here? The original name was a local name called Anomansa, which literally means inexhaustible supply of water. A name that gives self-identity to the people. They lost it. Why? Because of the Portuguese. But when they arrived in the year 1471, there was no structure like this for them to stay and do business. So the Portuguese had a ship docked on the ocean. They had tents mounted on the shores, used local boats or canoes for their transactions. But anytime there was a heavy downpour, wind or storm, it affected their business. That created inconvenience. As a result, they requested for a land, but their request for a land from the chief was denied by the chief. He said, I quote, "It is better for people to be good friends when they are living apart than when they are living together." What a powerful message, as if the chief knew what the future may hold. But the Portuguese never gave up on the chief because they knew what they were looking for. So they kept on pursuing, they kept on pushing him, and it took the chief 11 years, from 1471 until 1482, before the land was released. They mobilized themselves, came down with a strong team of artisans, numbered about 600, and that structure was built. Why? For two main reasons. One, to protect themselves from external forces who would attack due to competition. To protect, to enjoy monopoly over the trade along the stretch of West African coast. Now, whilst they were trading in gold, it did not take much time when the attention shifted to trading human beings. When Christopher Columbus, a man born in Italy in Genoa but spent most of his life in Spain, worked with the Spanish monarch for several years. Columbus did about 4 voyages in his lifetime. But during the first voyage in 1492 specifically, Christopher Columbus was heading towards India, but decided to use the Atlantic Ocean. Due to navigational issues, he and his team got lost, landed in the Bahamas on San El Salvador. So historically, he never set a foot on any American soil before he died. But today, what have we been told? The big lie is all over the world. That Columbus discovered America, but in reality he discovered nothing. How can someone discover an area that already existed with people live on it? That is not my take. My take now is this. When he got to the Bahamas, what happened thereafter? He and his team began to exploit the native Indians, which coincided with the Europeans' high demand for sugar, which affected the indigenous population. As a result, there was the need for them to have an alternative. The man named Bartolomeo de las Casas, he was a Spaniard at the same time a priest, who suggested that Africans could be used as alternative to the situation. Based on that evil suggestion, they did an experiment at Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and former Dominican Republic, that based on their own findings, they said Africans so much more stronger, they could resist the weather conditions, they were better alternative to the Indians, and the high demand for Africans on a large scale as better replacement to the Indians triggered. By 1519, officially, all the storage rooms over here were then turned into dungeons, which meant Africans that would be captured as enslaved would end up in the dungeons. The Portuguese were in charge of the slave dungeon for 155 years. But that was too little. Why? In the year 1637, the Dutch, through effort to the Portuguese, also captured this structure from the Portuguese, continued the same evil trade for 235 years. So how many years in total? Almost 400 years. 155 years for the Portuguese, 235 years for the Dutch. These two countries used this structure for trading human beings. Our ancestors were captured from different areas in Africa, put them in chains and shackles, and they traveled on foot for several days, weeks, months, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, hills to get to the dungeons. On their way to the dungeons, some died, and those who died were left behind, which meant they were left in the hands of wild animals. Others became too weak or exhausted. As a result, as they got closer, there is a place called Asimanso, where there is a slave river. They made a stopover, meant for each captive to have the last bathe. After the final bathe in the river, they had their hair trimmed, they were shaved with tools such as knives and razors. But let's begin to ask ourselves, how would razors and knives about 500 years ago being used on human beings look like? What a pain. What a traumatic experience. What a suffering. No one ever cared. After this evil treatment against their own will, they used palm oil to propagate the whole skin. Why? To disguise the physical sores and the wounds, to make them look healthy and good, and finally to brighten the skin before they moved them straight to the dungeons to be auctioned. Now from the slave river, where they had the last bathe, to this dungeon is 40 kilometers, about 25 miles. In chains and shackles, they traveled to get here, had them assembled over here, inspected by the physicians before they were auctioned. As we are going to experience, due to poor and unhygienic conditions of the dungeons, some died. And all those who died in the dungeons were just moved out and dumped into the ocean. In the year 1872, the Dutch sold the structure to the British. But before 1872, the British were already in Cape Coast, which is 30 minutes drive away from here, using Cape Coast dungeon for the same atrocities. And Cape Coast dungeon was built in the year 1664 to 1666. This was more than 200 years ahead of Cape Coast. Now, the British by 1807, they had a law passed for slavery to be abolished in their parliament. 1814 followed by the Dutch. 1815 Portugal. 1865 US also had a law passed. Unfortunately, illegal slave trade was still happening. Why? Because of two main reasons: high investment and money making a profit. It was difficult for these investors or participants to end this evil too holistically because they could not afford to lose everything at a go. There was the need for them to have an alternative. What was the alternative? There was a meeting in Germany called the Berlin Conference. At the end of the Berlin Conference, the entire continent was split or partitioned, and that gave birth to colonization. So someone will say from frying pan to fire, from slave trade, colonization emerged. and Ghana was colonized by the British. Then they used Cape Coast Dungeon, which was built by the British, and this one they bought from the Dutch for their administrative purpose in terms of colonization. After 85 years of colonization, 6th March 1957, Ghana liberated herself from the British colonialization through independence, and we have been in charge for 68 years now. Therefore, 155 years for the Portuguese, 235 years for the Dutch, almost 400 years for trading human beings, 85 years for colonization, 68 years post-independence for Ghana. This structure is 543 years old. This is the oldest, the biggest, the largest, and the first to come into contact with a slave trade along the coast of West Africa. Now this experience is very necessary. Why? Today, if you go to US, about 16 states in US have had a law passed that this type of history needs not to be taught in schools. If you go, for instance, in Florida, Wisconsin, DC, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and among many other states, this is happening. What is the lesson to us? It means if these structures are not preserved to today, many of these people have said this type of history never happened. But here we are, connecting ourselves to this time, experiencing this. And that's what personally, I do not subscribe that Black History Month should be February. Why? Every day, every week, every month, 365 days is a Black History Day for all of us. Why should we have only 28 days? In the whole 365 days, that's the only month or time for people to talk about their own history. If you and I do not keep our history alive, nobody else will do that. And this reminds me of what Rashidi Renoko once said. It is up to us to tell our own history without stuttering, stammering, whispering, and without apologies. It means we have a bigger responsibility on our shoulders to make sure that the true history, the true narrative is always preserved, is always told, is always shared, as against the sugar-coated narrative which is fast spreading. This is an introduction to the slave dungeon. If you have any question, you may ask before the experience of the main dungeons begins. Thank you. Any question? Now the best way to understand a history better is to experience it as a result. Let's move on and begin the actual experience.
I'm recording the whole time. Walk slow, walk slow. Okay.
Now this place that we are standing right now is the male slave courtyard. And as we are here, all the rooms on the ground floor were used as dungeons about 6 centuries. Enslaved men were shared among these dungeons awaiting shipment. But know something funny. Above the dungeons were residences for European missionaries, merchants, physicians, and soldiers. Above the soldiers, deputy governor, above him the governor. So what was the message at that time? The more important a person is perceived to be, the higher up he lived. Today, let's relate this to what is happening today. The hard-working employees are beneath the tower, and the chief executive officers are above the tower. Let's talk about the salary gap between them and the hard-working employees. This reminds me of what Malcolm X once said. A person who does not study history is doomed to repeat it. And history, as we speak, is still repeating itself. I shall illustrate it to you. Nothing is new under the sun. The structure that we set for the introduction was the first Roman Catholic church built by the Portuguese in the year 1596, where they claimed to be worshipping God over there. When the Dutch captured the structure from the Portuguese, the Dutch were Protestant and not Catholics. As a result, turned the church into an auction hall where they were doing the business of our ancestors. And they had their own church at a different location. When we get there, you will see where the Dutch also located their church. Unfortunately, they had their church located right above a slave dungeon. What an irony, what a hypocrisy. Now before we enter these two rooms, we can see a message on this wall. This message was written and placed on the wall in the year 1992 during the first Panafest, Pan-African Historical Theatre Festival. And the theme for the celebration was re-emergence of African civilization uniting Africans in the diaspora. There was a ceremony in this space called Fiankra, meaning when our ancestors or enslaved Africans were being taken away, they never had any chance of saying goodbye to their loved ones, family members, or relatives. At the end of the ceremony, this message was placed on the wall. As you and I can read, the main highlight is this: today, may people of African descent like you who wishes to come must be able to find and locate your roots. May humanity never again be given the same chance to perpetrate such injustice against humanity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now these are two cells. This is the European cell and this is the African cell, the condemned cell. Now one may ask, if this structure is a slave dungeon, why do you have European cell and a slave dungeon too? If dungeons were created for enslaved Africans to be held, why do you have a condemned cell? Before we do the experience to see the difference between the two cells, let's observe two things. One is the nature of the doors. Look at the European cell gate, it has a metal gate. Look at the condemned cell, it has a wooden gate. Look above the doors. The condemned cell has a skull and a crossbones, but the European cell has what? Nothing. Why differences in the doors and the symbols? Our experience and comparison will help us to find out more about it. Respectfully, let's get into the European cell first. Now this cell is called the European cell. As the name itself suggests, a cell created for European soldiers who misbehaved or misconducted themselves. That is, some of their own soldiers sometimes went to town without permission, got themselves into something that went contrary to their stated rules. As a result, they had to be disciplined. Now since the cell was meant for their own people, it has two vents, one on the left, one on my right, meant for enough air or breeze to come through. One may ask, how many soldiers were kept in at a time? Not more than 5. They had access to food, they had access to water, they were treated as human beings. How many are we? We are about almost 8 in number. We can still feel some fresh air coming from the windows. So just imagine about 5 people, it was very conducive for them. And few hours, they were released to return to their post.
3 hours?
Few hours. It could be less than 2, even maybe 3. Let's relate the experience of this cell to the condemned cell. Then we can make a fair judgment. Oh, sorry.
Come again.
Forgot to have some strong men around me. Let's see now. Now this cell, as the name itself implies, is the African cell, the condemned cell. A cell that was created purposely for enslaved Africans that were held in the dungeons. These people were not cowards. Despite the dehumanizing conditions, some of them were so loud in fighting for their freedom, fighting for their release. They said they were rebellious. As punishment, they took such ones out of the dungeons, put them back in chains, brought them into their cell, locked the door like this, and they starved all of them to death. No food, no water. No enslaved African ever came into the cell and left alive or survived. That is why we saw the skull and the crossbone, which represent death and which has been there since. This metal with the holes served as peepholes for the soldiers to look through from time to see if any enslaved is dead. The door was opened, the body was taken out and thrown into the ocean. One may ask, how many enslaved Africans were kept at a time? They did not have any specific number as far as the experience of this cell was concerned. So whether 10, 20, 30, 40, no one ever cared. So personally, I refer to the cell as a cell of no return. Why? None of our ancestors ever came to this room and left alive. Look on this side of the wall. Excuse me. What do you see? Scratches of their nails on the walls. You can see scratches of their fingernails on the walls. These represent the struggles that they were going through as they awaited death. Today, if these scratches are words for you and I to read, you will understand what they try to communicate. Unfortunately, we see them as mere scratches, but they represent a lot. Unfortunately, they could never communicate among themselves. Why? They came from different tribes, different areas with different languages. So you can see a fellow enslaved African dying, but there was no help that you could offer. Why? Because all of you find yourself in the same situation. Only death will end the suffocation, the pains that you're going through. No enslaved ever came and returned. But we are returning. So when we go back, we have a lot to share, a lot to keep alive. Any question before I move to the next section? Any question? At this point, you're moving straight to the dungeon, to walk through dungeons and see how our ancestors were treated in the dungeon as they awaited ship. Please, this is the one step that you're going to use to get to the dungeons. So please, let's take one. Now this is the famous slave courtyard, and all the rooms on the ground floor were used as dungeons where about 400 women were shared among the women's dungeons at Worcester. I'm going to pause here because I would just want us to use about 2 minutes to dig deeper to understand or comprehend about the numbers. About 600 men were shared in the men's dungeon and about 400 women in the women. How many are you talking about in total? 1,000. That is on the average of every 3 months, about 1,000 was shipped from this slave dungeon. And 3 months is equal to a quarter. And 4 quarters is to a year. So if a quarter was about 1,000, the 4 quarters would be about 4,000. Multiply 4,000 by 235 years, used by the Dutch for trading human beings. Do the same math for the Portuguese. We are talking about almost 2 million enslaved Africans that was shipped from this slave. And that is only this year. What about Cape Coast dungeon in Cape Coast? By the British. What about Christian Mokta in Accra, also by the Danes? What about Gorée Island in Senegal and other areas? The lives that were shipped cannot be quantified. But the big question that we need not to underestimate is this. How many enslaved Africans died when they were being captured, on their way to the dungeons, in the dungeons, during the Middle Passage, and when they began to work in the plantations? Again, the lives that were lost cannot be quantified. With all this in mind, people are so proud to make a statement that this type of history needs not to be taught in schools. What an irony, what a hypocrisy. Now, sexually in the dungeons, they were also abused. Because of the position of the governor, this is the balcony meant for him to stand, where he gave orders to have all the gates of the dungeons opened. All of them will be out here as we have somebody right now. He looked down to make a choice. But the one selected by the governor to be abused or to be raped by him had been in the dungeon for several days, weeks, and months without a bathe, brushing her teeth or washing down. So just imagine the stench. Because as a woman, every month, she has to go to a cycle. As a result, these are water reservoirs. These reservoirs were constructed by the Portuguese. Rainwater were harvested in them. And this contains 20,000 gallons of rainwater. So any enslaved woman chosen by the governor, they used a bucket, drew water from it, meant for the one chosen to bathe. But one may ask, at that time, what was the bathroom for her to stand and bathe? The bathroom at that time is the same space that you and I are standing right now. What an embarrassment. What a humiliation. What an insult. What a deprivation of a woman's right. No one ever cared. After this unfortunate embarrassment, she was given something small just to cover herself, to look better and attractive to the governor, forced to use this door. This is the staircase, and this staircase is connected to the governor's bedroom. So she was forced to use the staircase straight up into the governor's bedroom. There, she was raped by the governor. Now, after the rape, she returned to the same dungeon awaiting shipment. So anytime the ship arrived, all of them were examined by the physicians to identify those who had become pregnant. Why? They wanted a strong man for the journey, not enslaved women who had become too weak due to pregnancy. What would be the relevance of shipping those people away? As a result, they began to build stone houses outside the dungeons, move them in until they gave birth. The children were given European names. They were treated better, had a school established to give them education. As they grew up, they were brainwashed to believe that they were far superior to those of dark skin in the communities. And that began the era of colorism. As the kids grew up, gradually they were integrated into the whole business. As some became merchants, interpreters, agents, hence became part of the whole ecosystem that had been instituted. But some of these women were so courageous to resist rape while they were married before they were captured and separated. Those who were not married preferred to remain chaste. But any enslaved woman who was so courageous to resist had a punishment awaiting her. One may ask, what was the punishment? Let's find out from the cannonball. Now, during the peak of the slave trade, there were 8 cannonballs over here. And each cannonball weighs about 25 kg, equivalent to 50 pounds. Therefore, any enslaved woman who was so courageous to resist rape was chained to the cannonball and to her ankle for 24 hours. No food, no water. In the scorching heat, in the rains, with a heavy downpour, when storm tendered, she would be in it. Why? To put fear among the others in the dungeons. Let's see how this type of history is still repeating itself today. If anyone decides to travel a flight, what is the weight of your luggage?
50 pounds.
Any attempt to weigh more than 50 pounds, 8 pounds attract extra fee. Further to this, so that luggage may end up being confiscated. Likewise, any enslaved woman who was so courageous to resist, fighting for her right, was chained to 50 pounds of a cannonball. See how history is still repeating itself. As I said earlier, the best way to understand the history is to experience it and to relive it at the moment. At this point, we are going to walk through the dungeons and see how laughing the dungeons were. Let's begin from this side. Be ready for the stand. How do you feel? You can still smell. You can still feel the heavy stench in the dungeon. This about to see that indeed we are walking through the slave dungeon. Now the first room that we entered took about 100 enslaved women. This is the largest female slave where about 150 women were kept in this dungeon. The floor is still the original floor. That they were sleeping, lying, defecating, urinating, vomiting, and menstruating as women. So feces, urine, blood, vomit were all over the floor. And these doors had a wooden gate to prevent anyone from escaping. The only sources of light and ventilation came from 2 areas, where you can see the iron bars, this side and this side. These poor ventilation sources, based on the numbers that were brought here, it affected the mortality rate. As a result, an additional vent was fitted on this side to ease the situation. Unfortunately, it is connected to the magazine, where they kept the guns and the gunpowder. Anytime there was a leakage, due to the heat and the gunpowder, just imagine the residue of the toxins coming inside, which worsened the condition. As a result, it increased the mortality rate, and those who died were just taken out and thrown into the ocean. This is the same dungeon that they were fed with hot food, cornmeal, bread, rice, maize oil, and among others, but with what quantity? Little in quantity sustained them. As a result, others preferred to die by starving themselves, and those who refused to eat, one, they were paid, or they were beaten, and finally, they introduced a method called speckled arrows. In other words, a mouth opener. They forcefully open their mouth in order to feed them, that they could still survive life in the dungeons. There was no point that their situations or conditions became better. As things worsened from one point to the other. As you continue, you will see more. empty woman. We can see some clothes. We can see some chains on the floor. And these are not the original chains and clothes. But in the year 2016, we had a reenactment program in the dungeon. So due to the reenactment, the clothes were used by the participants to cover the covered parts. The chains were holding themselves. And these people slept in this dungeon for 12 hours. And after 12 hours of reenactment, the experience was too traumatic and unimaginable. Why? Mosquito bite was all over the participants. The stench was too hard to imagine. People therefore began to ask, if 12 hours in the dungeon about 9 years ago was so traumatic to experience, what about enslaved Africans who have been in the dungeon for a month? No, just under this one. Just a bat.
A bird.
A bird.
No, it's a bat.
So, just imagine. Let's go on. Yeah, welcome into the dungeon.
So the clock in there from 2016.
2016, yeah, whatever.
So like 9 years now.
9 years now. So the one person that took it us 12 hours about 9 years ago was such a traumatic experience. What about enslaved Africans who have been in the dungeon for a month, 2 months, or 3 months? And right above this dungeon was the church built by the Dutch, where they claimed to be worshiping God.
If you go pick up that food down in Ash, if you go pick up that food down in Ashboro and bring it back to his house, yes, he gon' yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah.
Any question before you proceed? Now, finally, a shepherd arrived. And all the men and women who survived in the dungeons were moved out of the dungeons, did their final re-examinations by the facility to make sure that indeed the strongest ones will make the journey across the ocean. Now, such ones, after the final inspection examinations, were put back in chains, connected to their fellow enslaved after in a long queue, and they began to move them batch by batch. As a result, all the women who survived in the female slave dungeons were forced to go through this passage to get into the room of no return, where they will go through the door of no return and began the journey. Now, when you go to Cape Coast Dungeon, whatever that you may see is called the door of return. Well, that door was recreated around 1998, when two remains, one from Jamaica, one from Barbados, the coaster from Jamaica and what was it? I've forgotten the other name, from US. When the remains were brought back, they went through that door and returned. And so they recreated the door over there to make the door of return. But here, we still have the door of no return because we cannot recreate the two. We have to maintain. And this is the original one. This is the first dungeon. So this one has always been maintained. So when we come here, we have the privilege to see the original door of no return. To see how the original door looks like. Then we can process to see how our ancestors were forced to go through that door. So the woman who survived went through this passage to get into the door of no return. At that time, there was a wooden staircase meant for them to go through. But the staircase is no more, as we have turned it into a drainage. So when it rains, the water could pass. That's why you have these bars to prevent anyone from going through this pipe because it's unsafe. So how are you going to get there? We are going to use the male passage or the men's passage to get into the room of no return. There, we are going to see the original door of no return. But when we see it, we're going to address three major questions. One, what is the size of the door of no return? For what reason was it created for and why? These and other questions will be answered when we get it. As a result, we did not want to miss that experience because we cannot do this tour without seeing the original door of no return. Let's be honest keeper. I should descend to the stage.
Make sure they fit, so they fit in them little slats.
Now let's see some writings over here. Very funny writings. These writings are in old Dutch, written in memory of a governor from Dutch, or a Dutch governor called L.A. van Tet, who came from Zeeland. Zeeland is a province in Netherlands. And this gentleman was the last director general of the Dutch work in this company over the north and south coast of Africa. Arrived on the 16th January 1758 in the same year on 12th of March at the age of 41. Just 2 months of arriving here, he died of malaria. Buried over here. So his remains are still on the ground here. Now when he died, there was a resident pastor, a Protestant, a Dutch, who wrote this tribute and said Van Tet was God-fearing, respectful, honest, and a just person. And one simple question that many people, countless people have always asked me is this: if he was God-fearing at the peak of slavery, what did he do about all the atrocities happening under his own watch? I don't have an answer. Maybe one day when the body is exhumed, then he can tell us more about it. Until then, I have nothing to say. Now, when the ship arrived, all the enslaved men who survived in the men's dungeon were moved out of the dungeons, put them in chains, and this is the middle passage that they had to use to get into the room of no return and began the journey. Let's go through the same process and see what God will do.
Taking a record of the whole world.
That's my goal.
Now, before we get into the room of no return, you can see a small room on the left. You can see a door open. That room that we are seeing today at that time was used as the branding room. The branding. Why do we see here identification marks or symbols? Some on the chest, some on the shoulders. Before they got into the room of no return to be shed. As a result, but one would end up dying due to the hotness of the metal being applied on the human on the skin. 2, do not underestimate the infection rate, because the same metal was applied on each person at a particular given time. So from the branded room straight to the room of no return. Now this brings to the issue: why branding? Because I did not appreciate the emotive better that they don't see our ancestors to be humans. As a result, submitting them to all forms of inhuman treatment when you look back into history about the history of branding, which began around 2100 BC, was being applied on animals, cows, to avoid theft. And now the same methodology was being used on human beings. And I have to see the ability behind the whole thing. From the branded room straight into the room of no return to be shared.
If y'all slow down, I'm gonna get y'all coming in. I'm recording the whole thing.
Please watch your head. One step down. One step down here. Watch your head. One step down. Watch your head. One step down. Watch your head. Keep coming. One step down. You keep coming. I think you record the video, so let's keep going. back. Keep your head low. Come on. Good, good.
Oh, get low, get low.
Yo, get up. Keep coming.
Oh, about to test these knees out. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness.
Go different. Go different. Go. Now this is the room of no return. Now this is the original door or the gate of no return. Now we all can see how narrow, how tiny, how smaller or little the size of the door is. One simple question that many people always ask is this: why this size of the door? Why too narrow? Why too tiny? Why too little? They did that for three main reasons. One, to control the enslaved Africans. Two, for easy counting, one at a time. And three, to dehumanize those that were captured. But narrowing the door into this side did not suggest that our ancestors who were captured from their own soil were not strong, they were. But due to the dehumanizing condition that they were subjected to when they were captured, with little food being given to sustain them, on their way to the dungeons, they were losing weight. In the dungeons, they kept on losing weight. By the time the ship arrived, the weight loss made it easier and possible for each captive to fit through this door. At that time, the sea or the ocean was up here, touching the structure. But due to its shallowness, the ship docked some few meters away. They used wooden boats or canoes, conveyed them into the ship. They were parked in the holdings below deck as if they were not humans, and the journey across the ocean began. Unfortunately, they never knew where they were going. They never knew how long the passage would be. The conditions on the ship, they had no knowledge about it. So there was no point that their situations or conditions became better, as things worsened from one point to the other. Today, as we have connected, as we are experienced, if these walls, which are the original walls, are humans and they have mouth to speak, they would have spoken better than me. Why? The tears were seen by the walls. The pains were felt by the walls. The voices were heard by the walls. But there was no human being around them to understand whatever they were going, because they had been separated for good. This reminds me of an old African proverb which says this: until the lion learned how to write its own story, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. In other words, until the lions have their own historian, the hunter will always be a hero. Today, if any of our ancestors were to be alive, the narrative would have been deeper than what I've shared with you. And indeed, some wanted to come back home to give a better account of their own experience and pains. They could never return because it was impossible at that time. But as a proud descendant, you have made such a dream a reality by coming back to the motherland to have this experience. I call it a pilgrimage. So when we go back, we have a lot to share, a lot to process, a lot to talk about. No enslaved African ever came to this room and returned. But today, we are going to return. So you could go back in peace with a lot to process. Let me share this poem with you. This poem was composed in 2019. And since then, I tried to add a little pieces to it to make it a complete poem. Europeans took away our ancestors. But our ancestry, they could never take away. So anytime we do our DNA test, where we trace our root to Africa. They took away our singers, but our songs, which identify we as Africans, they could never take it away. They took away our best dancers, but our dances, they could never. They took away our strong men and women from their own soil. The productive ones, or the productive ones were taken away from their own soil, but they could never take all Africans away. And today, we're able to come back home, see Africans on their own soil, living happily. This indeed is a treasure that we cannot be compromised. End of quote. If I want to talk, the talk will never end. Why? A lot happened, but little is being said. And no matter the amount of time that may be allocated for the tour, 2 hours or 1 hour cannot be used to tell a history of 400 years. As a result, we are going to return and recommend some books to you for you to get the valuable back home. So you can keep the history alive, not to allow the sugar-coated narrative to corrupt our mind. Please note, if we do not have any questions, we return. Please watch your hand once again. But you can take your pictures on top of no return as we return. Watch your head.
Anybody gonna try to go through? Yeah, I would have had to lose more weight. Yep. Ready?
Yeah, squeeze through this.
You can squeeze through. I got you. I'll record you. Oh, buddy. And it's going uphill. Oh. Oh. Made it. Mm-hmm. It's a good idea. Okay.